I thought I was uncovering one lie. By midnight, I understood I had been living beside an entirely different person. At first, that sounds like the kind of sentence people only say after years of therapy or after they have told the story so many times that the edges have gone dull. That was not how it felt while I was living it. While I was inside it, everything still looked ordinary enough that I kept trying to save the relationship from my own suspicions. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation smaller than betrayal, kinder than betrayal, easier to survive than betrayal. The truth did not care what I was ready for. From the outside, our life looked stable. We split rent, took trips, made future plans, and had enough shared history that people assumed we were inevitable. I was proud of how grounded we seemed. I thought adulthood had finally given me the relationship I had spent years trying to build: calm, serious, practical, and safe. That illusion lasted right up until the day it became impossible to explain the inconsistencies away. Hardest part to explain to people who have never lived through this kind of betrayal is how ordinary love makes you vulnerable in practical ways. You build habits around a person. You assume cooperation. You stop scanning every interaction for danger because commitment is supposed to reduce that burden, not increase it. That is why the early warning signs are so easy to miss. They arrive inside normal life, mixed in with shared meals, errands, bills, inside jokes, and routines that still look solid from a distance. By the time suspicion feels serious, your heart is already heavily invested in preserving a life that may no longer exist in the form you believed. What I did not understand then was how much trust can disguise danger when you are invested in continuity. There had been strange details before that day. Missing weekends explained too quickly. Receipts from places I had never heard mentioned. Social circles that somehow never touched mine. Stories with just enough specifics to sound true and just enough gaps to leave me uneasy. But because nothing arrived in one neat confession, I kept swallowing the discomfort and telling myself that trust requires tolerance for uncertainty. That lesson nearly ruined me. I kept minimizing it because I wanted the relationship to remain something I could repair with patience rather than something I would have to survive by leaving. What made it worse was not just the event itself. It was the way each new detail forced older memories to change shape. Moments that once felt harmless became loaded. Conversations that once felt routine became suspicious in hindsight. That is one of the ugliest parts of infidelity and deception. It does not only injure the present, it reaches backward and contaminates the meaning of things you once held with trust. What nobody prepares you for is how much energy betrayal steals before the relationship even officially ends. You start rereading old moments, checking your own tone, wondering whether you missed something obvious or whether you were simply loyal in a world that rewards people who hide well. That internal spiral is exhausting because it turns your own memory into a witness you no longer fully trust. I lived inside that spiral longer than I should have, mostly because admitting the full truth would have required me to accept how much of my life was about to change. The break came when a stranger messaged me on social media asking whether I had known my partner had been using another last name in another part of the city. I almost ignored it because it sounded absurd. Instead, I asked one more question, then another, and by the end of the exchange I had an address, a workplace photo, and enough context to realize I was not dealing with one affair or one bad decision. I was dealing with an entire parallel identity. Once suspicion became evidence, I entered a phase I still do not remember fondly. It was part investigation, part emotional free fall. I was checking devices, dates, receipts, and timelines while also trying to function like a normal adult. Every confirmation hurt, yet every confirmation also made me calmer in one specific way. I was no longer crazy. I was no longer misreading tension. The story was real, and because it was real, I could finally stop wasting energy trying to explain away what my instincts had been flagging for far too long. There is always a physical moment when the body understands before the mind does. My stomach dropped, my breathing changed, and the room seemed to narrow around whatever proof I was holding. I drove to the area the stranger mentioned and spent hours piecing together what should never have existed. There was another lease, another set of routines, another network of people who knew my partner by details that had never once been brought into my life. There were lies nested inside, lies so tightly that I could not immediately tell where performance ended and the real person began. That is what a double life does. It makes you question not only the relationship, but your own ability to know anyone at all. From that point on, I was no longer trying to decide whether something was wrong. I was trying to measure how long I had been living beside it without fully naming it. The scale of the truth matters because it changes the emotional category of what happened. As the facts stacked up, I stopped asking whether the relationship could be saved. I started asking whether any part of it had ever been real in the way I believed it was real. There had been true moments, I am sure of that now, but they had been layered over with active concealment. Love, once mixed with deliberate deception, becomes hard to recognize because memory and fraud start occupying the same emotional space. Once I understood that, I stopped asking whether the damage could be explained softly. I started asking whether I could respect myself if I kept staying inside a story that required me to deny what was already obvious. Even before I made any final decision, something in me had already started separating clarity from comfort. Comfort would have meant delaying the inevitable, softening language, and pretending confusion was still possible. Clarity meant naming what was in front of me without dressing it up. That shift hurt, but it also gave me back a level of internal steadiness I had been losing for a long time. Eventually, there is always a confrontation, whether you want one or not. I confronted my partner that evening with documents, screenshots, and questions so direct there was no room left for performance. The first response was not remorse. It was strategy. I watched them choose which facts to admit, which to deny, and which to postpone until they could invent better language. That taught me something brutal. A person who can maintain a double life can also improvise inside the moment of exposure if they believe your confusion might still be useful. In that conversation, I learned something I have seen repeated in almost every betrayal story since. When someone has been lying for long enough, exposure does not automatically produce honesty. Often it only produces a faster, more desperate form of strategy. I also learned that closure is rarely given cleanly by the person who caused the damage. More often, closure is assembled privately from facts, behavior, silence, and the eventual realization that you no longer need a better apology in order to make a better decision. That realization was painful because it forced me to stop waiting for the other person to become morally elegant after months of choosing something much uglier. After the confrontation, the aftermath begins, and the aftermath is rarely cinematic. It is practical, repetitive, humiliating, and emotionally expensive. When the truth finally widened, it was worse than I expected. Financial lies, emotional overlap, promises made in two directions, entire days and nights assigned to one life while I was told they belonged to another. I realized that betrayal at this scale is not a momentary collapse of character. It is an architecture. It requires planning, compartmentalization, and the willingness to let one person live in emotional darkness so another person can keep benefiting from the arrangement. That stage taught me more about character than the actual discovery did, because it showed me who I was becoming under pressure and who the other person remained when the lies were no longer working. There is also a social cost to betrayal that people underestimate. You start thinking about who knew what, who suspected what, and who watched the relationship deteriorate without saying a word. Even when no one intended to humiliate you, the mere possibility that other people noticed pieces of the truth before you did can feel like a second wound. It is not pure ego. It is the pain of realizing your private devastation may have had an audience long before you had language for it yourself. And then comes the part no one glamorizes: the paperwork, the practical decisions, the humiliating phone calls, the explanations you owe people who were never in the room when your life actually broke. Meals still have to be made. Bills still have to be paid. Work still expects your attention. Meanwhile, your mind is replaying scenes it cannot fix. That contrast between ordinary responsibility and extraordinary pain is one of the loneliest parts of the whole process. In the end, my decision was less dramatic than people imagine and more important than any single argument. Leaving was not dramatic. There was no satisfying final speech. There were boxes, signatures, blocked numbers, and a long season of waking up angry that I had not seen it sooner. But eventually, that anger softened into something more useful: discernment. I stopped romanticizing complexity when it was really just dishonesty with better lighting. I stopped mistaking confusion for depth, and I stopped believing love asks you to live inside a maze built by someone else. That decision did not erase grief. It simply gave grief a direction. Instead of circling endlessly around the betrayal, I began moving away from it, step by difficult step. Recovery did not begin with peace. It began with routine. I had to rebuild trust in small, unglamorous ways, by keeping promises to myself, by protecting my sleep, by speaking honestly to the people who had earned access to my life, and by refusing to keep confusing suffering with loyalty. That process was slower than I wanted and less dramatic than movies teach us to expect. But it was real, and reality mattered more to me now than performance ever could. A major part of recovery had nothing to do with the other person and everything to do with identity. I had to figure out who I was when I was no longer organizing my choices around managing their moods, their lies, or the fallout from their decisions. That sounds abstract until you live it. Then it becomes very practical. Different mornings, different habits, different spending, different boundaries, different standards for what gets access to your time. The rebuild was not only emotional, it was structural, and that structural change is what made the healing last instead of feeling temporary. The day I discovered my partner's double life, I lost more than a relationship. I lost the version of myself that thought consistency was always visible from the outside. But I gained something too. I gained the ability to leave faster when reality and explanation no longer match. That has protected my peace more than any promise ever did. I do not tell this story because I enjoy revisiting it. I tell it because there are people still living inside the version of confusion I once called normal. If you are one of them, I hope you understand this. Clarity may arrive quietly, but once it arrives, it asks something of you. It asks whether you will keep protecting a lie because you are afraid of what truth will cost, or whether you will accept the cost and finally keep your own dignity intact. That choice is brutal. It is also where a real life starts again, and that is the part I wish more people understood. Betrayal is dramatic in the discovery, but its real meaning is revealed in what you do next. Do you go back to sleep emotionally because the truth is expensive, or do you let that truth reorganize your life around something cleaner? That question changed everything for me. If you have lived through something similar, then you already know the answer is never simple. But it is still worth saying